The airlock behind me hissed and I knew our piece was over. I was standing in the observation corridor of Ceres Station when the sound hit. A short, sharp release of pressure that meant something had been forced open that should never open on its own. My hands went cold before my mind caught up with what was happening. 30 seconds earlier, I had been checking a pressure gauge because my father asked me to. Now the lights along the corridor flickered to a dim red glow, the kind reserved only for the worst kind of emergency, and I heard heavy footsteps coming down the metal floor, footsteps too large and too even to belong to anyone from our station. My name is Cade, and I was 14 years old the day the Caliph came for us. I did not have time to run. I did not have time to think about running. The footsteps grew louder, and then 3 shapes filled the end of the corridor, each one taller than any door frame on the station, their outer shells catching the red light like wet stone. Their eyes were dark and many-sided, and their long arms ended in claws built for tearing through metal, not for shaking hands. I had heard stories about the Caliph from traders who passed through our sector, stories about outposts that went silent overnight, about mining crews that were never heard from again. I had always believed those stories happened to other people, in other places, far away from home. They were not far away anymore. I had a wrench in my hand, the same wrench I used to tighten bolts on the ventilation system, and it felt impossibly small against creatures who had crossed the void to take everything we had built. The lead one noticed me standing there and made a low clicking sound that I later understood was something close to laughter. Small one, it said, its voice flat and mechanical through a translator device fixed to its throat. Step aside and nothing will happen to you. I did not step aside. Behind me, past the bend in the corridor, was the habitation ring where my father worked, where my little sister Ellie was likely still asleep, where 40 other people who had built this outpost with their own hands were now in danger, because 3 armored soldiers had decided our home was worth taking. I thought about running to warn them, but running would take time we did not have, and something told me that if I turned my back on these 3, they would be moving again before I took 3 steps. So I stood my ground, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I looked past the lead soldier at the reactor valve mounted on the wall behind me, the one my father had shown me 100 times, the one meant only for emergencies when the cooling system needed to be flushed by hand. I reached back without looking and cracked it open just enough that the pressure gauge beside it began climbing. "You should turn around," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. "Why is that?" the soldier asked, and I could hear the amusement in its tone even through the translator. "Because in less than 2 minutes this corridor is going to fill with steam hot enough to melt the wiring in your suits, and I am the only person on this station who knows how to stop it before it happens." That was not entirely true. The valve controlled coolant flow, not steam directly, but the truth did not matter in that moment. What mattered was that the gauge behind me was climbing fast, glowing yellow and then orange, and the soldiers could see it as clearly as I could. I had learned enough from my father to know that Caliph armor, built for the cold silence of space, was never designed to handle sustained heat. It was the only piece of information I had, and I gambled everything on it being enough. The 3 of them exchanged a series of clicks and gestures I could not understand, but I recognized the shape of hesitation when I saw it, because I had seen it in the miners many times before, right before they decided a tunnel was too unstable to enter. The lead soldier's claws twitched, testing the air, feeling the rising heat radiating from the vents beside me. "This is not finished," it said finally, before all 3 turned and moved back toward the airlock they had forced open, their heavy steps retreating into the dark beyond the station hull. I did not celebrate. I knew, somewhere deep down, that this had only bought us time, not safety. The moment the outer door sealed behind them, I threw myself at the valve and cranked it shut, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the metal. When the gauge finally dropped back into the safe range, I allowed myself exactly 3 seconds to breathe before I started running toward the habitation ring. The corridors of Ceres Station had never felt so long. Every door I passed was either locked from the inside or hanging open with nobody behind it, and the emergency lighting painted everything in the same dull red that made every shadow look like something waiting to move. When I finally reached the central hub, I found my father already there, along with a dozen others, all of them gathered around a communication panel that had gone completely dark. "Cade," my father said when he saw me, relief and fear crossing his face at the same time. "Where is Ellie?" I had not thought of that. In the chaos of the corridor, in the seconds spent staring down 3 armored soldiers, I had not once considered where my little sister might be. The realization hit me harder than the sound of the airlock ever had. "She was asleep in our quarters," I said, and before my father could answer, I was already moving, weaving through the gathered crowd and back into the corridors I had just run through. Our quarters were on the far side of the ring, past 2 junctions and a stairwell that connected the upper deck to the lower storage levels. I had made that walk 1,000 times without thinking about it, but now every corner felt like a place something could be waiting. I kept my wrench in my hand, not because I believed it could stop anything, but because holding something gave my hands a job to do besides shaking. When I reached our quarters, the door was already open, and my heart dropped into my stomach before I saw Ellie standing just inside, fully awake, clutching the small stuffed animal she had carried since she was 3 years old. She looked more curious than afraid, too young to understand what the red lights and the distant clicking sounds meant. "Cade, why is everything red?" she asked, and I realized I had never been so relieved to hear a simple question in my life. "We have to go," I told her, taking her hand and pulling her gently but urgently into the corridor. I did not tell her why. I did not want her to understand why yet. We had barely made it back to the first junction when I heard the sound again. The same heavy footsteps, closer this time, coming from a direction I had not expected. My stomach turned as I realized the Caliph had not left the station entirely. They had simply moved to another entry point, perhaps deciding that a lone, frightened boy with a wrench was not worth abandoning the entire mission over. I pulled Ellie into a maintenance alcove just off the main corridor, pressing us both against the cold metal wall as the footsteps grew louder. Through a narrow gap in the paneling, I watched 2 Caliph soldiers move past, different from the ones I had faced before, their armor marked with different patterns along the shoulders. They were carrying equipment I did not recognize, boxy devices with blinking lights that they placed at intervals along the corridor wall. I did not know what those devices did, but I knew instinctively that letting them finish their work would be worse than anything that had happened so far. My father had once told me that raiders who take their time are raiders who plan to stay, and staying meant they intended to take the entire station, not just what they could carry. Once the soldiers moved further down the corridor, I pulled Ellie carefully out of the alcove and we made our way back toward the central hub through a service passage that ran beneath the main corridor, a route only the station's engineers usually used. It was tight and dark, and smelled of old grease, but it kept us out of sight, and for the first time since the airlock hissed open, I felt like we had a small advantage. When we finally emerged near the hub, my father grabbed Ellie into his arms and held her tightly, his relief written plainly across his face. But there was no time to rest. Grace, the station's engineering lead, was already speaking urgently to the small crowd that had gathered, her voice tight with controlled fear. "They have placed devices along 3 separate corridors," she said. "If those are what I think they are, this station's main structure could be compromised within the hour." I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "I know where 2 of them are," I said. "I saw them being placed." Every eye in the room turned toward me, and for a moment I felt impossibly young standing there, a 14-year-old boy claiming to know something that mattered in a crisis this large. But Grace only nodded, her expression sharpening with focus rather than doubt. "Show me," she said. What followed was the strangest hour of my life, moving through the station's hidden service passages alongside Grace and 2 other engineers, a woman named Nora and a quiet man named Owen, both of whom had worked the mining tunnels long enough to know every hidden route the station had to offer. We moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the main corridors where the Caliph patrols continued their slow, methodical work, and one by one we located the devices they had placed. Nora explained in hushed tones as we crouched beside the first device, that it appeared designed to weaken the station's structural supports gradually, not through any sudden action, but through a controlled process meant to make the outer hull unstable enough to force an evacuation, after which the Caliph could take whatever they wanted without resistance. It was a patient kind of raid, one built on pressure rather than force, and somehow that realization frightened me more than the sight of the soldiers themselves. Owen worked quickly to disable the first device once we confirmed what it was, using tools not unlike the ones I used every day for routine maintenance. It was strange to think that the same skills used to keep our station running could also be used to unmake whatever the Caliph intended to build. We found the second device without much trouble, hidden behind a coolant pipe in a corridor Ellie and I had passed through only an hour earlier. But the third device, the one Grace worried about most, was in a section of the station none of us had access to without passing directly through one of the patrol routes. I volunteered before anyone could suggest otherwise. "I know that corridor," I said. "I have walked it every day for 2 years. I know where the shadows fall and where the lights flicker. I can get close without being seen." My father wanted to argue. I could see it in the tightness around his eyes, but he also understood, perhaps better than anyone, that I had already faced these soldiers once and lived to describe exactly what frightened them. Grace nodded slowly, and together we worked out a plan that relied on nothing more dramatic than patience and careful timing. I moved alone through the final stretch of corridor, timing my steps between the slow, methodical patrol I had watched from a distance, staying low and close to the wall where the shadows pooled thickest. When I finally reached the last device, my hands were steadier than I expected them to be. Perhaps because I had already done this once before, already proven to myself that fear did not have to control every decision I made. I disabled the device exactly as Owen had shown me, and for a moment, standing there in that quiet corridor, I allowed myself to believe that the worst of it might be over. It was not. The lead soldier from the earlier confrontation found me there, standing over the disabled device, and this time there was no room in its stance for hesitation. It recognized me immediately, and whatever amusement it had shown before was entirely gone. "Small one," it said, "you have caused more trouble than your size should allow." I had no valve to threaten it with this time, no rising gauge to point toward, only the truth of what I had just done standing plainly between us. I thought, in that moment, that my luck had finally run out. But then I remembered something Nora had mentioned in passing, almost as an afterthought, while we worked on the second device. She had said the devices ran on a frequency that, if reversed, could be redirected back through the very systems monitoring them, creating a feedback loop the Caliph equipment was not built to withstand. I had not fully understood the science of it at the time, but I understood enough now to know it was the only card left in my hand. I reached down to the disabled device at my feet, and rather than simply leaving it dead, I reconnected 2 wires Owen had shown me, reversing the very sequence he had used to shut it down. The device flickered back to life, but wrong somehow, emitting a low pulse that made the soldier's translator device crackle with static, and its claws twitched involuntarily, as if the sound itself had struck a nerve none of us understood. It staggered back a single step, clearly disoriented, and in that brief opening I did not attack, because I had never wanted to attack, only to buy enough time and confusion to slip past. I moved quickly down the side passage Owen had shown me earlier, leaving the soldier struggling to regain its composure behind me. I did not stop running until I reached the central hub again, breathless, my legs aching, but alive, and more importantly, having bought the station enough confusion among the Caliph patrols that Grace was able to seal the outer corridors using the station's emergency bulkhead system, something that had not been possible while the devices remained active and monitoring our movements. The Caliph, cut off from their equipment and unable to complete whatever patient plan they had been building, made the decision every raider eventually makes when the cost of staying outweighs the reward of leaving. Within the hour, the same airlock that had hissed open at the start of this entire ordeal sealed shut again, this time from the outside, as their ship disengaged from the station's hull and disappeared back into the dark. We did not celebrate immediately. Grace insisted on a full inspection of every corridor and every system before anyone allowed themselves to believe the danger had truly passed. It took most of the remaining night to confirm that the station's structure was intact and that no other devices had been left behind. Ellie fell asleep in my father's arms long before that inspection finished, exhausted in the way only children can be after a night too big for them to fully understand. I did not sleep at all. I sat with my father in the central hub, the wrench still in my hand, turning it over slowly as the adrenaline that had carried me through the night finally began to fade, leaving behind something closer to disbelief. I kept thinking about the moment the airlock first hissed open, how certain I had been that our lives were about to end, and how strange it felt now to be sitting quietly in the same station, still breathing, still whole. My father did not say much that night. He simply sat beside me, his arm resting across my shoulders, the same way he had 100 times before during smaller, quieter emergencies that now felt impossibly distant compared to what we had just survived. Eventually he spoke only one sentence, the same words he had told me many times growing up, words I finally understood in a way I never had before. "This station was built by people who had nothing but their own hands and their own determination," he said, "and that has always been enough." I did not fully believe him when I was younger, when those words felt more like comfort than truth. But sitting there that night, having faced something far larger and far stronger than myself, and having somehow found a way through it, I understood exactly what he meant. The Caliph never returned to Ceres Station, not that year, and not in the years that followed. I do not know if word spread among their kind about the outpost that refused to fall as easily as expected, or if they simply moved on to find easier targets elsewhere in the vast dark beyond our small corner of space. What I do know is that every person on that station, from the youngest child to the oldest engineer, walked a little taller in the months afterward, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that when everything had been at stake, we had found a way to stand our ground. I was 14 years old the night 3 soldiers built for conquest looked at a boy holding nothing more than a simple tool and decided, if only for a moment, that retreating was the wiser choice. I have carried that night with me ever since, not as a memory of fear, but as a reminder that even the smallest among us can hold a line worth holding, when the people behind that line are the ones we love most.